He had never thought his years of service would one day put him in the path of such deep misunderstanding. He had always believed that wearing the badge meant protecting others, standing for fairness and treating everyone with dignity. From the very beginning, that was what guided him. His journey in law enforcement started in quiet determination, not ambition. He was the kind of person who preferred results over recognition, who showed up early, stayed late, and did the work without complaint. Colleagues described him as steady, calm, and impossible to shake. When tensions rose, he was the voice that brought balance. When new recruits entered the room with doubts, he offered advice that stayed with them for years. He believed in the idea that justice should never be partial. To him, truth was a simple concept. It either was or it wasn't. Over the years, he climbed through the ranks not because of politics or connections, but because of the respect he earned. His superiors trusted his instincts. Agents under his command admired his composure. Even when the days were long and the cases complex, he never lost sight of the people behind the paperwork, the families who needed answers, the victims who needed peace. Away from work, he was gentle and private. He enjoyed quiet weekends, reading old crime novels or taking long walks with his thoughts. Those who knew him personally often said he carried the weight of others' pain, even when he didn't have to. His job required toughness, but inside, he was deeply empathetic. That's what made him different. He never flaunted his title, though it was an impressive one. As a captain in the Bureau, he had taken part in high-level operations that saved lives and dismantled dangerous criminal networks. Yet he never told those stories publicly. When people asked what he did for a living, he usually smiled and said, "Just government work." He didn't need to be the center of attention. The quiet satisfaction of doing the right thing was enough. But even with his experience, even with his reputation, there were moments when he sensed that the world didn't always see him the same way he saw himself. Sometimes while traveling through unfamiliar towns, he noticed the lingering looks. Sometimes the tone in someone's voice changed when they realized he wasn't from there. He learned to let those things pass. "You can't change every heart," he often told himself. "You just do your part and hope your actions speak louder than prejudice." That philosophy had guided him through 20 long years of service. He had seen both the best and worst sides of humanity. He had watched young officers grow into responsible leaders and others burn out under the pressure. He had witnessed corruption and courage living side by side in the same departments. But through it all, he kept his sense of duty. He believed that every badge, federal or local, stood for something sacred. Law enforcement was supposed to protect people, not frighten them. He had spent years trying to build better cooperation between federal and local units, teaching younger officers to act with restraint and understanding. "Power means responsibility," he used to say in his training sessions. "And responsibility means patience." That was the version of him most people knew, calm, grounded, thoughtful. But behind that quiet discipline was also a man who carried fatigue. The long hours, the constant scrutiny, the weight of leadership, they all took their toll. Still, he never let it show. The job had become part of who he was. One Thursday evening, after finishing a conference in another state, he decided to drive home instead of flying. It was late, but the road was peaceful and he preferred the silence of the highway to the noise of airports. He wore plain clothes, nothing that identified his position, and drove a rental car, just another traveler heading home after a long week. He rolled down the window a little, letting the cool night air clear his head. The sky was open and dark, the kind of quiet that lets you think. He thought about his upcoming weekend, about resting, maybe catching up with old friends. The conference had gone well. Discussions about better coordination between agencies, new technology, ways to make the system fairer and more efficient. He felt proud of the progress they were making. The radio hummed softly as the miles passed. The highway lights faded in and out. There was no rush. He was only a few hours from home. He didn't know that his calm drive through that small town would soon become one of the defining moments of his life. He had passed through small towns many times before, places where everyone seemed to know everyone, where strangers stood out immediately. But he always believed that professionalism transcended borders. Law enforcement, he thought, was a brotherhood bound by duty, no matter the uniform. He couldn't have imagined that his own badge, the very symbol of that brotherhood, would soon be doubted. As he drove into the outskirts of a rural area, the road narrowed. Streetlights were scarce and the only sound was the steady hum of his tires. He slowed down as the GPS indicated a small town ahead, a place he had never been. It was one of those quiet towns that seemed to fall asleep by 9 p.m. Gas stations closed early, diners dimmed their signs, and silence settled across the streets. The night air felt peaceful, and he didn't notice the patrol car parked in the dark shoulder until its lights suddenly flashed red and blue. He glanced at the rearview mirror. The flashing lights reflected in his eyes a familiar signal. His first thought was that maybe he'd crossed the line by mistake. He pulled over calmly to the side of the road, as he had taught so many others to do. As the car came to a stop, he took a slow breath. He had no reason to worry, he thought. Traffic stops were routine. He reached for his wallet and identification, keeping his hands visible. He had done this 100 times before, but this time felt different. He couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the tone of the officer's voice when he approached, or the harshness of the flashlight shining directly into his face. "Evening. Officer," he said politely, his tone calm. "Was I speeding?" The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked suspiciously inside the car. His eyes lingered on the man behind the wheel longer than necessary. "License and registration," the officer said firmly. He handed them over, including his federal identification, explaining briefly that he was an FBI captain returning home from a training event. The words should have cleared everything. Normally, identification like that would lead to a short, professional conversation, maybe even mutual respect. But tonight, the silence that followed was sharp. The officer stared at the badge for a few seconds, then frowned. "This real?" he asked. He looked up, surprised by the question. "Yes, sir. You can verify it easily," he replied. The officer didn't respond, just stepped back toward his patrol car, still holding the documents. From the rearview mirror, he could see the officer speaking to someone on the radio, glancing back at him occasionally. The air inside the car grew heavy. He stayed still, hands on the wheel, watching the faint movement of the police lights. He reminded himself to stay patient, stay professional. This was not the first time someone doubted him, and it likely wouldn't be the last. But deep down he felt something uneasy brewing. Minutes passed. The second patrol car pulled up behind the first one. Another officer stepped out. He exhaled slowly. "All right," he whispered to himself. "Just keep calm." That was who he was, a calm man in any storm. But the storm was beginning to build. The night was quiet except for the distant hum of engines and the soft rustle of wind across the trees. He sat behind the wheel, watching the flashing lights dance across the empty road. It wasn't the first time he had been stopped while traveling, but this one felt different. Something about the silence, the delay, the way the officer had looked at him. It all carried a strange weight. He waited patiently, his hands still resting on the steering wheel where they could be seen clearly. Years of experience had taught him that calmness was the best tool in any uncertain situation. The air outside was cool, yet he could feel sweat forming along the back of his neck. He tried to shake off the feeling of unease. "It's fine," he told himself quietly. "Just a misunderstanding." Minutes passed before the first officer returned, this time with another one by his side. Both of them approached slowly, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The beams of light flicked across his face, his dashboard, his jacket, and then back again, as if they were searching for something that wasn't there. "Step out of the vehicle," one of them said firmly. He didn't argue. "Of course," he replied in a calm voice, opening the door slowly and stepping out. His movements were deliberate, steady. He had taught others how to handle tense situations exactly like this. Hands visible, no sudden motions, no raised voice. He stood beside the car while they looked him over. The younger officer, the one who had first stopped him, seemed uneasy but defiant, as if convinced that something was wrong. The older officer stayed quiet, his face hard to read. "I already explained who I am," he said respectfully, keeping his voice even. "My identification is genuine. You can contact the Bureau right now if there's any doubt." The officer didn't seem interested in verification. "Sir, keep your hands where we can see them," he ordered. He raised his hands slightly, the gesture calm and non-threatening. "They're right here," he said softly. One of the officers stepped closer, shining his light directly into his eyes. "Where are you headed tonight?" "I'm driving home from a federal training event," he replied. "It's been a long week, so I decided to drive instead of fly." The officer's expression didn't change. "You said you're with the FBI?" "Yes, my ID is on the hood of the car where you left it." The second officer looked at the badge lying on the hood. The gold emblem reflected the blue and red lights from the patrol cars. For a long moment, no one said anything. Inside, he felt frustration begin to grow, not out of anger, but disbelief. He had worked with local police departments across the country. He had built partnerships, offered training, shared resources. He believed in cooperation between agencies. Yet here he was, treated not as a colleague, not as a fellow officer, but as a stranger under suspicion. He tried again, choosing his words carefully. "Please call the nearest field office. They'll confirm everything." The first officer frowned. "Sir, I'll ask you to stay quiet for now." He nodded slowly, lowering his gaze to the ground. There was no point in arguing. His instincts told him that pushing back would only make things worse. Behind him, he could hear the sound of the second officer's radio crackling, muffled voices exchanging information. He couldn't make out what they were saying, but it didn't sound like they were trying to verify his identity. The minutes stretched on like hours. Every breath felt heavier. He thought about all the times he had given lectures on de-escalation, on communication, on empathy. He had stood in front of classrooms filled with young recruits, teaching them that authority didn't mean intimidation. And now he was standing in front of two officers who didn't seem to recognize those lessons. The first officer circled around the car again, shining his flashlight inside. "Do you have any weapons in the vehicle?" he asked sharply. "Yes," he answered honestly. "I'm a federal officer. My service firearm is in the glove compartment secured." That word, firearm, seemed to change the air instantly. The younger officer stiffened, his hand moving toward his belt. The tension in the space was immediate and visible. "It's locked and holstered," he added quickly. "Standard issue. I'm not armed right now." The officer didn't relax. He could see in the man's eyes a kind of automatic suspicion, a quick judgment that didn't fit the facts. He wanted to say more, to explain, but he knew that sometimes words made things worse. "Step back," the officer ordered. "Now." He did as he was told, taking a slow step backward, his palms still open. His mind stayed focused, his breathing controlled. Years of experience told him not to let fear take over. He wasn't afraid of these officers, but he was afraid of what fear could make people do. The second officer looked uncertain now, almost as if he realized the situation didn't make sense. But the first one seemed too wound up to stop. The radio crackled again, and a voice said something about waiting for verification. They weren't sure who he was yet. They wanted to make sure. He could feel the weight of irony pressing down on him. The man who had spent his life ensuring justice was now standing on the side of a quiet road, waiting for someone to confirm he wasn't a threat. He looked around. The town was silent. A single streetlight flickered nearby, casting long shadows on the pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed faintly. The whole scene felt surreal, like a moment caught between reality and disbelief. He tried to remind himself that this would pass. That reason would win out, but deep down he also knew how long it sometimes took for reason to appear. "Sir?" he said again gently. "Please, you can contact my office. They'll confirm everything." The officer ignored him. Instead, he motioned to the other one to keep watch while he walked back to the patrol car again. The two exchanged quiet words, glancing toward him now and then. He stood perfectly still. In moments like this, stillness was safety. Stillness was clarity. His mind drifted briefly to his years of service, the long nights in the field, the times he'd trusted strangers for the sake of duty, the times cooperation had saved lives. He had always believed that unity in law enforcement was stronger than division. But tonight, that belief was being tested in ways he hadn't expected. He could see the reflection of his own car in the patrol light, his bag still in the back seat, his suit jacket folded neatly, his ID badge glinting faintly on the hood. It was strange how ordinary things could suddenly look unfamiliar when the world turned uncertain. Finally, the second officer approached again, this time holding a small notepad. "What's your date of birth?" he asked. He gave it. Then came more questions. Where he worked, where he was traveling from, who his supervisor was. He answered each one clearly, patiently. The officer wrote everything down but didn't meet his eyes. He wasn't angry. What he felt was heavier than anger, something closer to sorrow. Because he knew, deep inside, That this wasn't just about a traffic stop or a mistake in identification. This was about doubt, about perception, about the way a person could be seen before being understood. The radio buzzed again. Another pause. Another long silence. He could see the first officer pacing slightly near the car, restless. Every small movement felt amplified in the cool night air. He wanted to believe that any second now the call would come through. Someone would confirm his identity, and the misunderstanding would end. Maybe there would be awkward apologies, maybe a handshake, maybe an explanation. That was what should have happened, but the seconds kept passing and the call didn't come. The quiet between them grew uncomfortable. Even the second officer began to shift uneasily, glancing at his partner, then back at him. It was as if they were waiting for something to justify what they had already assumed. He lowered his gaze again, focusing on his breathing, reminding himself that patience was his strength. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the faint scent of pine from the nearby woods. Somewhere above, an airplane crossed the sky, its lights blinking faintly through the darkness. Life went on elsewhere, but here, time seemed frozen. He thought of his family waiting at home, of how he'd promised to be there before midnight. He thought of the friends who trusted him, the agents who looked up to him, the communities that believed in the integrity of his badge. He thought of all the times he had told young recruits, "Stay calm. Even when you're misunderstood, stay calm." That advice had never felt so hard to follow. The flashing lights continued to flicker against the trees, painting the road in red and blue. Inside, he felt a mix of sadness and disbelief, but he kept his expression steady. He didn't know how this night would end, but he knew one thing for sure. He would not let frustration change who he was. He stood quietly on the edge of the road, hands still visible, eyes steady, waiting for fairness to catch up with reality. The station was smaller than he expected, a plain brick building with tired lights and the faint smell of old coffee drifting through the air. He had been inside hundreds of police buildings before, but this one felt different the moment he stepped through the door. There was no sense of order, no calm professionalism. The eyes that met him weren't curious, they were suspicious. He tried not to show how tired he felt. It had been a long drive, a long night, and now a long wait. He had thought that once they reached the station, everything would be cleared up quickly. They would verify his ID, make a few phone calls, and realize the mistake. He even imagined the conversation that would follow. Awkward apologies, maybe a handshake, a quiet ride home. But the moment the door closed behind him, he realized this was not going to be that simple. A young officer at the desk barely looked up when he entered. The two who had brought him in spoke quietly to her, handing over his identification. She glanced at it for a second and shrugged, sliding it into a drawer without much care. He watched as the badge, something that had taken him decades to earn, disappeared out of sight. He stayed calm. Years of experience had trained him to read rooms, to understand when patience mattered more than words. He knew that anger never fixed a misunderstanding. It only deepened it. So he waited. One of the officers motioned for him to sit on a bench near the wall. The metal seat was cold and the light above buzzed faintly. The seconds ticked by. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the occasional murmur of voices and the click of a computer keyboard somewhere in the back. He looked around and saw small details that spoke volumes. The outdated posters about community safety, the stack of paperwork piled high on the counter, the weary look on an older officer's face as he poured himself another cup of coffee. This was a department like many small-town stations, overworked, underfunded, and often left out of bigger conversations. He understood that, but understanding didn't make this moment any easier. He tried again to speak calmly. "Officer, could you please call the federal field office? They'll confirm my identity right away." No one responded. The younger officer, the one who had pulled him over, kept his back turned, pretending to be busy. The other one stood near the door, arms crossed, watching without expression. It wasn't hostility exactly, it was something quieter, colder. Doubt mixed with pride. He could feel frustration pressing at the edge of his calm. He took a slow breath and looked down at his hands. They were steady. His whole career had been built on being steady. Finally, after what felt like an hour, someone came from an office in the back. The man was older, maybe a supervisor. He carried himself with authority, but also a kind of weariness. He looked at him briefly, then at the officers. "What's the situation?" the supervisor asked. The younger officer straightened up quickly. "Traffic stop, sir. Suspicious individual claiming to be FBI. Had what looks like a fake badge. Also admitted to having a firearm in the car." The older man turned his eyes toward him. "That correct?" He nodded calmly. "Yes, sir. I'm a federal captain. The firearm is my issued service weapon, locked and secured. You can confirm with the Bureau's verification line right now." The supervisor didn't answer right away. He picked up the phone, dialed a number, and waited. After a few seconds, he frowned. "Line's not connecting." "It's after hours," he added, looking slightly uncertain. He wanted to explain that federal offices had 24-hour emergency contact systems, that there were verification protocols specifically for moments like this. But he stopped himself. Sometimes too much explanation made people defensive. The older officer put down the phone and sighed. "Until we can verify who you are, we'll need to hold you for questioning." It took him a second to process the words. Hold him? Question him? For what? He had done nothing wrong. He had followed every instruction, stayed respectful, offered full cooperation. But he could see that no explanation was going to matter tonight. He nodded slowly, more out of disbelief than agreement. "I understand," he said quietly. They led him to a small holding area, a space barely big enough for 2 chairs and a bench. The air inside was cool and dry. The light flickered occasionally. He sat down, resting his elbows on his knees, staring at the blank wall in front of him. He thought of his team back at the Bureau, probably wondering why he hadn't checked in. He thought of his phone in the glove compartment of the car, turned off, unreachable. He thought of how surreal it was that a man who had led complex federal operations was now sitting alone in a small-town cell because someone didn't believe his badge. The hours passed slowly. Every sound in the building felt amplified. The ring of a phone, the squeak of boots against the floor, the low murmur of voices outside the door. At one point, a different officer came in to ask for his information again. Full name, position, contact number, field office. He gave every detail clearly. The officer wrote it down and left without a word. He closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep but to find peace. He had spent his entire career teaching others to trust the system, to believe that truth would always rise above confusion. Tonight that belief was being tested. He wondered how many others had sat where he was sitting, waiting for fairness to catch up. Sometime near dawn, he heard footsteps and the clatter of keys. The same young officer from before stepped in. He avoided eye contact at first, flipping through a clipboard. Then, without much emotion, he said, "You're being held for processing. They'll figure things out in the morning." He didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. As the morning light crept through the narrow window, he noticed how the world outside continued normally. Cars passed, people went to work, the day began. Inside, time stood still. He had been in difficult places before, but this one was different because it wasn't about danger. It was about disbelief. About being unseen for who he really was. By noon, the room felt smaller. He sat quietly, thinking about how a single moment could change the way a person was perceived. All it took was a uniform, a tone, a decision not to listen. He tried to let go of bitterness. Anger would only take away his clarity. Later that afternoon, a different officer, a woman this time, came by with a folder in her hands. She looked hesitant. "We're still waiting on verification," she said, almost apologetically. "It shouldn't be much longer," he nodded. "Thank you." Her tone was softer than the others. For the first time, someone had spoken to him like a person, not a problem. It reminded him of why he had chosen his career in the first place, to protect the values of fairness and respect that seemed so fragile in moments like this. Evening came, and the station grew quieter. Through the small window, he could see the fading sunlight painting the sky orange and pink. He sat there, hands folded, reflecting on the irony of it all. The man who had built trust between agencies was now at the mercy of mistrust. He thought of all the people he had helped over the years, all the communities that had once looked to him for justice. Would they believe this story if he told it? Would anyone? He smiled faintly at the thought. Maybe someday this moment would become a lesson, not one about authority or pride, but about perspective. How easily assumptions could cloud judgment, how quickly respect could turn to suspicion. When the night finally settled again, The room fell silent except for the hum of the lights. He leaned back against the wall, tired but not broken. He knew the truth would surface eventually, it always did. The waiting was the hardest part. In that stillness, he made himself a quiet promise. If he got out of this situation, if this misunderstanding was ever cleared, he would dedicate his time to making sure it didn't happen to others. No one should have to sit in silence, unseen, unheard, for doing nothing but existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so he waited, patiently, quietly, knowing that the truth, even when delayed, never disappeared. It just took the world a little longer to see it. Room was still, and for the first time in hours, the silence didn't feel heavy. It just felt empty. He heard footsteps in the hallway before the door opened. The same woman officer from the day before entered carrying a small folder in her hands. She gave a polite nod, her voice gentle. "They're reviewing your case right now. There's been a call from someone in the federal office asking about you." He looked up, relief flashing briefly across his face. "Thank you," he said quietly. She gave a small smile, then left as quickly as she came. The door closed again, but this time the air inside the room felt lighter. Someone had finally realized something was wrong. Someone was asking questions. A few minutes later, he could hear the muffled sound of voices down the hall. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone had changed, less certain, more cautious. Papers shuffled, phones rang, and a door opened and closed. The rhythm of the building felt different now, like it had suddenly woken up. Then the older supervisor from the night before entered. His face was stern, but there was a flicker of discomfort in his eyes. He held a phone in one hand and a printout in the other. "We've been in contact with the Bureau," he said, clearing his throat. "They've confirmed your identification." The words hit the air softly, almost casually, but for him they carried the weight of the entire night. He nodded slowly. "I appreciate you confirming it," he said. The officer shifted his weight. "We'll be sorting out your release shortly." There was some confusion. That was the word they used. It sounded so small, so harmless. But to him that word represented hours of humiliation, disbelief, and silence. Still, he didn't respond with anger. He had learned long ago that anger often closed doors that truth could open. "I understand," he said, though the words felt heavy. When he finally stepped out of that holding room, the sunlight outside was blinding. He blinked, breathing deeply for the first time in what felt like forever. The fresh air felt different now, sharper, colder, but real. He could see the two officers who had brought him in standing near the door, avoiding his eyes. No one said anything. No one apologized. A black SUV pulled up outside the station, and two federal agents stepped out. He recognized one of them from a nearby field office. They looked relieved but concerned. "Sir, are you all right?" one of them asked quietly. He nodded. "I'm fine." They guided him to the car and handed him back his badge and belongings. The gold emblem of the badge felt heavier in his hands now, like it had absorbed the weight of everything that happened. As they drove away, he looked back at the small brick station fading into the distance. He didn't feel victory or satisfaction. He just felt tired. Back at the Bureau's regional office, everything moved fast. There were calls, reports, questions from higher-ups. The department's internal review team wanted statements. The story had already begun to spread. Someone at the local station had leaked information to a reporter. Within hours, news outlets were calling it a mistaken arrest. But it was more than that. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a moment that exposed something deeper. He sat in a conference room with a few colleagues answering questions about the night. They were respectful, careful with their words. One of them leaned forward and said softly, "We saw the footage from their dashcam. You handled yourself with incredible calm. That could have gone very differently." He nodded, his eyes distant. "I've spent years teaching patience," he said. "Last night I had to live it." They sat in silence for a moment. Everyone in that room understood the weight of what had happened, even if no one said it out loud. By the next morning, the story had reached national headlines. FBI captain wrongly detained by local police. The words appeared on television screens, in newspapers, on social media. People were shocked. Some were angry. Others were simply disappointed that something like this could still happen. He didn't want fame or attention. He wanted accountability, but he also wanted understanding. He didn't want the story to turn into a war between departments. He wanted people to see it as a lesson, not a weapon. When he walked through the halls of his office later that day, his colleagues greeted him with quiet nods of respect. Some patted him on the shoulder. "Glad you're back," one said. Another murmured, "We're all behind you." But inside, he wasn't sure what to feel. He was grateful, yes, but he also felt a sadness he couldn't shake. He had always believed in the brotherhood of law enforcement, the idea that they were all on the same side. Now he saw how fragile that belief could be when bias entered the room. Later that week, an internal review was launched. The local department involved faced scrutiny. Officials from the Bureau sent investigators to gather information, review footage, and interview the officers involved. He stayed out of the process, not wanting to influence anything. He wanted truth, not revenge. But the truth came out anyway. The investigation revealed that his identification had been valid from the start. The officers had been advised by their dispatch to verify it through a standard federal channel, but they had ignored the guidance. The report mentioned unnecessary escalation and failure to follow protocol. It also included notes from past complaints against one of the officers, citing unprofessional conduct during traffic stops. The findings spread quickly. The department's leadership faced questions from the media. The chief held a press conference calling it an unfortunate misunderstanding. The phrase echoed through every news report, but to the public it didn't sound convincing. People saw the video. They saw how calm he had been, how compliant, how respectful, and how that hadn't mattered. He didn't watch the footage himself. He didn't need to. He had lived every second of it. One morning, while reading through a draft of the official report, he paused and looked out the window. The city below was busy. Cars moving, people walking, life continuing as if nothing had changed. But he knew something had changed. Not just for him, but for everyone watching. Later that day, a journalist requested an interview. She wanted him to talk about what happened, how he felt, what he thought it meant. At first he refused. He didn't want to become a symbol or a headline. But after a few days he agreed, on one condition. He would only speak if the story focused on reform, not resentment. The interview aired on a Sunday evening. He spoke calmly, his voice measured, his eyes steady. "I don't want anyone to be angry for me," he said. "I want people to learn from this. We can't fix mistakes by blaming. We fix them by understanding why they happen and preventing them next time." The response was overwhelming. People from across the country reached out, law enforcement officers, community leaders, everyday citizens. Some shared their own experiences of misunderstanding and unfair judgment. Others simply thanked him for his grace under pressure. In the weeks that followed, he noticed a quiet shift. Departments across several states began reviewing their identification and verification policies. Training sessions were updated to include scenarios based on what had happened to him. It was slow progress, but it was real. He often thought back to that night on the side of the road, the flashing lights, the cold air, the silence between words. He remembered the doubt in the officers' eyes, the way they looked at him like they couldn't imagine someone like him holding authority. It hurt, but it also reminded him why he joined law enforcement in the first place, to make the system better. One person at a time. He never wanted to be the center of attention, but life has a way of choosing its own moments. What had started as a painful misunderstanding had become a story that reached far beyond one small town. It wasn't about blame anymore, it was about reflection, and for him that was enough. He returned to his daily work quietly, without fuss. He continued mentoring young agents, leading investigations, and giving speeches about fairness and integrity. But when he spoke now, his words carried a deeper meaning. People listened differently because they knew he wasn't just talking theory, he was talking truth. One evening, long after the noise of the media had faded, he stood alone in his office looking at his badge. It was polished, golden, almost glowing in the soft light. He ran his fingers across its surface, thinking about everything it represented. Duty, sacrifice, trust. That trust had been tested, and yet it still stood. He smiled faintly and whispered to himself, "Sometimes, the hardest lessons are the ones that teach the world the most." Then he turned off the light and walked out, the door closing softly behind him. Weeks had passed since the incident, but he still couldn't shake the feeling that something important had shifted, not just in his life, but in the lives of those who had watched his story unfold. The initial headlines had faded, The media cycles moved on, but the conversations had just begun. Everywhere he went, he heard whispers about the need for change, for fairness in how the system treated everyone, regardless of rank, title, or background. His role at the Bureau had returned to normal, but he was no longer just a captain in the field. Now he was someone people turned to for advice on reform, on trust, on building better relationships between departments and communities. It wasn't what he had expected when the chaos first started, but it felt right. He still thought back to that night when he had been detained. It had been one of the most difficult moments of his career, and yet, as time went on, he found a certain peace in the experience. The anger he had initially felt had faded, replaced with a sense of purpose. Every mistake, every misunderstanding had a lesson in it. He had always believed that, and now he had lived it. One afternoon, he sat at his desk, reading through reports when his phone rang. He didn't recognize the number, but something told him to pick it up. "Hello?" A voice on the other end was familiar. "Hi, this is the sheriff's office from the station where you were held a few weeks ago." He sat up straight. "Yes, we've been doing some reflection of our own, and we'd like to apologize to you. We didn't handle things the way we should have that night." His heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected an apology, especially not so directly. "Thank you," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "I appreciate you reaching out," the sheriff continued, his tone sincere. "We've been retraining our officers on handling situations like yours. We're trying to do better, and we just wanted to let you know that we've learned from what happened. It was small, but it meant something." In that moment, he realized the real power of this experience wasn't in the headlines or the internal reviews. It was in the ripple effect. People were listening. Change was happening, even if it started small, even if it took time. He hung up the phone and sat back in his chair. The apology wasn't just for him. It was for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of assumptions, because of biases. It was a recognition that systems could be flawed, and that people had the power to correct them. He thought of the countless officers and civilians who were out there, trying to build trust between communities and law enforcement. This moment, this phone call, was a sign that change was possible. Later that day, he found himself walking through the office halls, catching the eyes of colleagues who gave him knowing glances. They had heard the news and many had read the reports. He wasn't sure if they saw him differently now, but he didn't mind. The respect he had earned over the years wasn't something that could be easily undone. It was the foundation of his career, of his reputation. And now, with the story behind him, he felt like he had a new mission, one that went beyond just enforcing the law. The truth was, he had always believed in the system. But now he believed even more in its potential to grow, to adapt, and to heal. What had happened to him wasn't the end of the story. It was a turning point. A few weeks later, he was invited to a conference on law enforcement reform, one that focused on improving relationships between police and the communities they served. It was being held at a university, and the panel was filled with experts, activists, and officers from all over the country. He wasn't sure what to expect, but as soon as he walked into the room, he knew he was exactly where he needed to be. He sat down at the panel, the spotlight now on him in a way that made him slightly uncomfortable. He wasn't used to being the face of something. He was just a man doing his job. But the more he listened to the questions from the audience, the more he realized that this was bigger than one person. This was about everyone who had ever felt unseen, unheard, or misunderstood by the system. The moderator introduced him. "We're honored to have Captain here with us today," he said. "He's someone who has become a symbol of resilience, of accountability, and of trust in the face of a situation that no one could have predicted." The words felt strange, almost foreign. He didn't want to be a symbol. He just wanted to do his job. But as he looked out at the sea of faces, some curious, some skeptical, some hopeful, he knew that the moment had come for him to speak up. "I don't think of myself as a symbol," he started, his voice steady. "I'm just a man who believes in the work we do and the oath we take to protect and serve. But what happened to me that night was a reminder that we have work to do, not just in law enforcement, but in how we see each other. We all come to this job with different perspectives, and sometimes those perspectives shape our actions in ways we don't even realize." He paused, letting the words sink in. "What I want you all to know is that we're all part of the same system. We're all human, and we have a responsibility to listen, to really listen when people speak. Whether they wear a badge or not." The room was quiet. No one interrupted, no one made a sound. But he could feel the weight of his words, how they resonated with the people listening. We can't change everything overnight, but we can start by making sure that no one is overlooked, no one is judged before they've had the chance to show who they really are. We can make sure that no matter where we come from or what we look like, we all have a voice in this conversation. The audience was still silent, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence that felt like understanding. He could see the heads nodding, the subtle shifts in posture that signaled people were listening, really listening. After the session, several people came up to him. Officers thanked him for his words, as did some community leaders. A few people even shared their own stories with him, stories of being misunderstood or treated unfairly. They didn't expect him to fix everything, but hearing someone in a position of authority say those words, to admit that the system had flaws and needed to change, meant more than they could express. As the conference ended, he felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. This was why he had started this job in the first place. Not for the power, not for the recognition, but for the chance to make a difference, to be part of something bigger than himself. When he got back to the office, the phone rang again. It was another call from the sheriff's office. This time, the voice on the other end was more familiar. "I just wanted to let you know that we've been working on new training procedures," the sheriff said. "We're focusing on improving how we handle situations like yours. We're going to make sure that our officers understand the importance of patience, of understanding the situation before making assumptions, and we're going to make sure that our community knows we're here to protect everyone." He felt a warm rush of pride. "That's good to hear," he said quietly. "It's a start. That's all we can ask for right now." As he hung up the phone, he leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of it all settle in. He wasn't naive enough to think that everything was perfect, that everything would change overnight. But he knew this was a step in the right direction. And he had helped make it happen. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. Not because the world was perfect, but because he knew that it could be better. And that was enough.